I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1813 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the First Amendment and its relationship to the Vietnam War, and some of the things that are happening today that are directly related to that interaction of the First Amendment and the Vietnam War. But first, before we get into that, my good buddy Willie Thomas has something he'd like to say. So Willie, you've got the mic. Go for it.
This episode is brought to you by Legacy Staffs, which are crafted by the Brazos Walking Stick Company in Waco, Texas. You can go to brazosticks.com and use the name Mac Payne, one word, at the checkout and get 10% off your next order of the Legacy Staff or cane of your own design.
I hope you all take advantage of the deal that Willie was telling us about. I have one of those Legacy Staffs, and it has become one of my most prized possessions. I guarantee that if you get your own customized Legacy Staff, you will feel the same way about yours as I feel about my Legacy Staff. So don't delay. Go over to brazosticks.com and get yours before the guys out there in Waco retract that tremendous 10% discount offer. Now let's move on to the primary topic of this podcast episode. The First Amendment is one of the greatest benefits of being an American citizen. We enjoy free speech. That's a very interesting topic because when the guys who wrote up our Constitution and put that in there, the whole world was aghast. Everybody said, you can't do that. That won't work. You can't allow the citizens of a country to say whatever they want to say. The writers of the Constitution responded to all the critics by going ahead and putting it in there. Ever since they put it in there, that poor First Amendment has been under all sorts of pressures. It's been abused. It's been beat up. It's been attacked. It's been criticized. It's been assaulted. But it's still there to this day, and thank goodness it's there for all of us. In the year 2020 in the United States, as we all know, there's all sorts of things going on. We have the problem with this nasty COVID-19 virus. We've got rioting in the streets. All sorts of challenges are out there for us. Every once in a while, the President of the United States, on this day of August the 6th, 2020, the President is Donald J. Trump. He sometimes will go to the room where they do press conferences and speak for himself. I always get a kick out of when he finishes and he says, okay, does anybody have any questions? It's like crazy time. They'll all start screaming. They don't seem to ask questions. They seem to assault the president. They say, you did this, you said this, why did you say that? This is wrong, you're stupid, blah, 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 blah. I get a kick out of it because I don't think these people in the press room are really journalists. They seem to be more like advocates of a particular viewpoint in the country. And sometimes you wonder if the First Amendment can stand up to all this. Anything can happen in that type of an environment. You get the wrong person in there and he can start throwing all those people in prison or other terrible things. I don't think that's going to happen with this president, but it could. When you ponder what goes on in the press room these days, and you wonder how all this got started, well, you might consider looking at a story written by Dante A. Campaglia. He wrote a story about this situation that appeared in the Red Book Star-Revue website. Title of it was Dateline-Saigon Remembers the Journalist Who Revealed a Dirty War by Dante A. Campaglia. I'm going to share a portion of his article with you to give you some food for thought about our First Amendment. One of the primary things Dante talks about in his story is a documentary titled Dateline-Saigon. It was put out by filmmaker Thomas D. Herman. I wonder how he was able to beat out Ken Burns, who normally makes these type documentaries. This documentary is about the reporters over in Vietnam that had a big influence over there. First of all, before we get into it, a word about Dante A. Campaglia. He is an award-winning digital journalist, a writer, editor, photographer. He's based in New York City. His work has been published by the Star-Revue, Time, Architectural Record, and Forbes, among other publications. He is also an editor with senior and management level experience, mostly in the digital world, but he's also had his foot in the print side of the media at places like Newsweek, Time, and Sports Illustrated. So Dante's been around. I doubt if he's up in New York these days with everything that's going on there. Dante talked to Thomas D. Herman, the person who put together this documentary titled Dateline-Saigon. I highly recommend you take a look at it. It can be very educational. It may not be on your political side of the spectrum, but it's very good to know these things. This is what they say about Dateline-Saigon on their website. It starts out with saying 5 journalists risk their lives to bring back a story no one wanted revealed. Bob Schieffer says it's the best film about journalism in Vietnam ever made. The film talks about 5 young reporters who took on a superpower and who wins. Dateline-Saigon is the story of 5 young journalists whose courageous reporting during the early years of the Vietnam War in the face of fierce opposition and worse from government is uncannily relevant to challenges journalists face today. The documentary was narrated by none other than Sam Waterston. I'm sure you remember Sam from the early days of Law and Order. Dateline-Saigon has all the drama and high stakes of All the President's Men and the tragedy and romance of the quiet American. That is the documentary I'm encouraging you to take a look at, just so you are aware of the full story. We must look at all sides of an issue. There will be a link to where you can get all the information you need to see Dateline-Saigon on the podcast website. Go over to VietnamVeteranNews.com, episode 1813. There will be everything you need to hook up with Dateline-Saigon. Now you know about the documentary. Let's take a look at some of the things Dante A. Campaglia wrote about the movie. He interviewed Mr. Herman, who put this documentary together. I'm going to share a little bit of the story with you, written by Dante, and maybe throw in a few comments here and there. But remember, the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast is totally fair and balanced. We try to tell every side of every story. We don't always succeed, but we try. Let's take a look at some of Dante A. Campaglia's story, titled Dateline-Saigon Remembers the Journalist Who Revealed a Dirty War by Dante A. Campaglia. Again, it appeared in the Red Book Star-Revue website. Dateline, New York City. Back in 1960, Associated Press reporter Malcolm Brown was sent to Saigon to report on the conflict between the Communist North and American-backed South. He was soon joined in the AP Bureau by none other than Peter Arnett and photojournalist Horst Foss. They found themselves competing with upstart UPI reporter Neil Sheehan and brass New York Times journalist David Halberstam on the beat as the Vietnamese Civil War erupted into an American-led war of Cold War containment. The consequences of that escalation, the protest and culture wars, the draft, and the quagmire were all years away. But the reporting those journalists did and the price they paid for it foretold what was in store for America. That story has been eclipsed by Vietnam's more provocative media moments, such as My Lai, Agent Orange, Walter Cronkite declaring the war unwinnable on national TV. But it was resuscitated by filmmaker Thomas D. Herman in his documentary Dateline-Saigon. The Vietnam experience of Halberstam, Sheehan, Brown, Arnett, and Foss upended how conflict was covered in the American press, and it gave the government and its enablers ammunition in its war against the First Amendment, and the reporters, some still feel, cost the country victory. And despite being more than a half a century past, Vietnam has proven it will never be done with us, nor we with it. Dateline-Saigon's release comes as the country is more divided than any time since the 1960s. The fault lines are familiar: civil rights, brutal crackdowns of protest, state-sponsored attempts to delegitimize the press, and they vibrate throughout that documentary. Herman spoke with the Star-Revue about his unexpectedly relevant film and the journalist at the center of it. I encourage you to go over and see the entire documentary, Dateline-Saigon, and you will hear the comments from all those reporters and more. Here is how Dante concludes his story about Dateline-Saigon and the First Amendment in Vietnam. I quote Dante here where he writes, "I am hopeful that the viewpoint that journalists caused us to lose the war is a minority viewpoint. But I think another very contemporary and relevant point, and I think you've picked up on this, is President Trump's war on the press is not the first time the government has declared war on the press. Trump has taken it to a new level and has gone to lengths that no one else previously in his position has gone, and has really ignited an anti-journalism movement of fervor in this country. But this is not the first time. The First Amendment is precious to me. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all of that. But it's something that every generation has to struggle to maintain. It is not something that is happening only today. It's not a one-time thing. It happened during Vietnam. President Nixon had his enemies list with a number of journalists' names on it. It happened to a lesser degree in World War I under President Woodrow Wilson and his Attorney General. Censorship was imposed by Lincoln during the Civil War. There was not censorship imposed during Vietnam. There were a lot of rules, and the journalists did not break those rules. But Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson knew they could not impose censorship. The country would not stand for it. Freedom of the press is essential to democracy, in my opinion. It was obviously essential to a democracy among the Founding Fathers because there would not have been a First Amendment, and it would not have been so importantly defended and described by politicians and by the Supreme Court for many years afterwards. But it's under attack right now in a way. I think that perhaps it has never been previously. But it is under attack right now in a way I think that perhaps has never been previously. We cannot take it for granted. Fortunately, there's some extraordinarily good journalism going on today and some smart and honorable people who understand the importance of freedom of the press. Not only among so-called liberals, true conservatives understand the importance of this as well. But every generation has to fight for it. That last sentence uttered by Dante is one that I support 100%. But there are a few things I would like to mention here in this last paragraph. He talks about President Trump attacking the media worse than it's ever been attacked. If you look at it from a fair and balanced viewpoint, you can understand why. Even before he became the president, the media was out there screaming about all these terrible things that he allegedly did. Never once did I hear the media do some investigative reporting to look into some of these charges. They all said, hey, it's true. He's no good. We got to throw him out. I didn't see a lot of balance in the media. It's only natural that someone would react to it. It looks like the people who are concerned about the First Amendment, when they talk about what President Trump is doing, are surprised that President Trump is someone who would stand up to it, unlike others who would be sort of mousy and say, well, that's the way it is. I think that's all part of a healthy discussion about the First Amendment. Something else he said in here about the Vietnam War. There was no censorship imposed during the Vietnam War. There were a lot of rules, and the journalists didn't break those rules. Pardon me, but I was over there in Vietnam for 2 years and ran into numerous so-called journalists. Some of them were sort of nasty, and they would do anything to get a story because they were paid by the published line. So they were desperate to write things that would get published. Sometimes they would bend the story a little bit to make it more sensational. As far as his statement, there were a lot of rules imposed on journalists over there in Vietnam. I never saw any limitation on the press over there. They did whatever they wanted to do, they went wherever they wanted to go, and they wrote whatever they wanted to write. I was sorry that Dante did not include in his list of journalists my favorite one, Jed Duvall. I had the opportunity to spend some time with him, and I was able to see some of the good points and the bad points of the reporters over there in Vietnam. I will not go into the bad points about Jed Duvall because I respect the man too much. Still like him today. But I would be very careful making statements like, the journalists did not break those rules. I have to disagree on that point. Speaking as someone who was there for 2 years, the main purpose of this podcast episode is to emphasize the value and importance of the First Amendment and to make sure we always stand up for it and protect it and ensure that it stays there for future generations to enjoy. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. Make sure you go over to the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com, episode 1813, and go check out that documentary, Dateline-Saigon. You may like it or you may hate it, but it's things that we really need to know about the Vietnam War so we know how to go into the future with a little bit more wisdom. Thank you for listening. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?